After 18 presentations that I conducted over the last 4 years, we have made it, and it's only fitting that this last presentation be given by yet another great champion of Tampa history, Maura Barrios, who's a community historian focused on the history of Tampa's Cuban communities of West Tampa and Ybor City and the connections between Tampa and Cuba. Maura was curator of the Ybor City State Museum exhibit, Tampa y Cuba, More Than 100 Years, in 2007. In 2004, Maura received a major grant from the Florida Humanities Council for the community autobiography project, Our West Side Stories, Voces de West Tampa, 2005-2006. Barrios earned a master's degree in Latin American history from the University of South Florida in 1998. She has presented her work at Latin American Studies Association, Florida International University, Cuban Research Institute, New College, Tampa Bay History Center, Carnegie Mellon University, University of Houston, and the Latino Arts and Culture Institute. And it's a real pleasure to have the Queen of West Tampa with us.
I need the banner that says Queen of West Tampa.
Viva la Reina!
La Tampeña is my actual real name. I want to thank National Endowment for the Humanities for funding this amazing program, and I know you all have enjoyed it and appreciate it as much as we Tampeños do. And I want to thank James and Dr. Ray for organizing this. I know how difficult organizing a conference can be. So, so congratulations to you. Here we are. And of course to the University of Tampa, which has always been here and maybe neglected a bit by us. But it's really great to see this university really growing. And I keep thinking this is the place for the Center for Marti Studies. And there's a vacuum right now, so you have the opportunity. I'm gonna read, because if I don't, I get lost. So, and Kenya's gonna help me with the images. So let me just start. I'm a product of the Great Society, when the nation decided they needed everyone to be educated to meet the future needs of industry and technology. The first generation of working class kids who attended university en masse. It was the 60s. Working class kids plus education equaled revolution. I attended USF at that special time when social history reigned in the history department and the professors had discovered Ybor City. I studied Cuban history with Lou Perez, comparative race relations with Alejandro de la Fuente, and Robert Ingalls had just published his amazing book on labor history in Tampa, Urban Vigilantes in the New South. And I have a copy here, it's really amazing. Gary Mormino had also just published The Immigrant World of Ybor Cities, focused on Italians. And Nancy Hewitt was writing about women cigar workers in a variety of articles. And Susan Greenbaum was immersed as a participant observer in La Unión Martí Maceo for many years. I wanted to be an anthropologist after I met Susan. And the Ybor City novelist, Jose Iglesias, collaborated with the history and theater departments at USF and visited often. I met him. I felt that I'd found my intellectual home. In 1992, Lou Perez organized the first Marti Conference, honoring the 100th anniversary of Marti's presence in Tampa, with presentations by professors from Havana, controversial at that time, and met with violence. Sometimes an outsider sees your barrio as a magic place that you take for granted. Kenya Dworkity Mendez gave me that gift of seeing my world through her eyes. I am forever grateful. Of all the readings on Cuban history, my favorite statement on the Cuban condition comes from Fernando Ortiz, Cuban Counterpoint. Sugar enslaves, tobacco liberates. I wanted to know everything about tobacco and Cuba and cigar makers and the lives of my ancestors. I spent hours at USF Special Collections Library on the literature search, and too much time scrolling microfilm of the 1890s Tampa Tribune, Tampa Morning Tribune. At this same time, our city promoted Ybor City as the Latin Quarter, while the displaced Latins created the Ybor City State Museum to not be forgotten. And the city of Tampa began celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. So what is wrong with these pictures? City of Tampa, Hispanic Heritage. With his sword, with his legs open. So it's certainly not Tampa. And the flamenco dancer doesn't really even represent the Spaniards of Tampa because they're not from the south. They're from Asturias and Galicia and Santander and the northern part of Spain. So I don't know how that happened, but this is the world that I was experiencing at that time. In my archaeological dig at the libraries, I noticed two disappeared stories. Cubans, although the main ingredient in our Latin melting pot, and the other cigar city, West Tampa. So I decided to dedicate myself to those topics. The result was a community history project, Our West Side Stories, Voces de West Tampa, and a state museum, Ybor State Museum exhibit, Tampa y Cuba, the 500-year connection. I also had the privilege to talk about Tampeños Tobacco at a 2003 international conference in Havana celebrating the 150th anniversary of Jose Marti's birth. And in 2005, at the City Historian of Havana's Tobacco Conference. Now, I am a born-again Cuban. This presentation is an experiment. It is part history, part essay, part memoir, and photo exhibit. I hope it works. You let me know. My purpose for the presentation is to highlight the Cuban cigar workers' experiences in Tampa, especially those in the barrio of West Tampa. You are all familiar with Ybor City and Marti in Tampa. I want to broaden the discussion to tell untold stories. This is necessarily an impressionistic style, to cover experiences over time from BC and AC Tampa, before cigars and after cigars. I'm concerned with the question, what is the legacy of Marti and his social democratic vision, and does it survive across generations of time? I offer the stories from West Tampa and a few of my own memories. Think about your readings and lectures as we move across time and topics to consider these questions. I always have to start at the beginning of the Tampa Cuba story. The History Museums mark Fort Brooke as the beginning of Tampa's history. However, Cuban fishing ranchos dotted southwest Florida and Tampa Bay for 200 years before the soldiers arrived. And Calusa natives enjoyed diplomatic relations with the Spanish governors in Havana. In fact, they ended up living in Cuba. The few that remained after they were all wiped out ended up in Cuba. La Florida, governed by captain generals living in La Habana, joined the United States as manifestly destined in 1821. Almost immediately, the U.S. waged 2 wars on the Seminole Nation. They shipped Seminoles and Cuban Seminoles to New Orleans, where locals recognized that some were speaking Spanish. The others went on to Oklahoma or hid in the Everglades. There's wonderful work on this topic by Cantor Brown, Early Tampa History. So we have some images. This is actually on Bayshore Boulevard, you know, the elite boulevard of Tampa. And most people don't know it, but that was where these Cuban Seminoles and these Cuban fishermen were hanging out in these little ranchos.
This is going all the way down south, is it? Along Bayshore?
It's somewhere in the middle of the Bayshore Boulevard. You'll see it.
No.
I don't know who put the marker up or when, but it's quite a surprise to find that. I never knew about it. And do we have, the next is, this is one of the ranchos, believe it or not, it was still there when in the late 1800s, I think. And then some of the Seminole Indians. There was intermarriage between Seminoles and Cuban fishermen. And that's why some of them spoke Spanish. Okay. Next, moving on to Tampa, 1885 BC, before cigars. The remote alligator land did not attract many American settlers until Henry Plant's railroad smashed through the pine forest, connected to his steamship line, and sailed south to Havana, the Paris of the Caribbean. Just imagine moving from one place to the other. You can read some diaries of people landing in Tampa at that time. Not very fun. Alligators, mosquitoes, sand, no dirt, no roads, no sidewalks. A lot of mud. They were miserable, especially the women. To build a city, business leaders determined to attract an economic base beyond the beautiful resort at Tampa Bay Hotel. A Cuban visitor looking for guava land happened to stop by. The guava connection led to an invitation of cigar manufacturers in Key West who suffered worker strikes and a devastating fire in 1885. A promise by the Tampa Board of Trade to control the radical cigar workers sealed the deal. Ybor City developed rapidly around the cigar industry. Thus, the city grew on a foundation of cigars. Now we're going to look at the other cigar city. I'm not going to talk about Ybor City because I assume you are saturated with Ybor City. So here is the 1892 plat map. Inspired by the success of Ybor, City Attorney Hugh McFarlane, a Scottish immigrant, looked west of the river to build a second cigar city. He platted 200 acres in 1892. The locals referred to Ybor as Cuba City and West Tampa as Cuba Town during those early years. The city of West Tampa incorporated in 1895. Its independence from the city of Tampa allowed for political and economic control and a very unique identity. They elected 10-year war hero Fernando Figueredo Socarrás as first mayor in 1895. In fact, the majority of elected mayors and councilmen of West Tampa were Cuban immigrants. Cuban to the core, as my friend Kenya said, of West Tampa. Okay, moving on to talk a little bit about the Cuban independence struggle in West Tampa. Cubans wanted to recreate Havana in the frontier swampland. By 1894-95, they built the 3-story Céspedes Hall, named after the leader of the Cuban 10 Years' War. The hall included meeting rooms, a ballroom, a mutual aid society, and a school for children. It was West Tampa's center for Cuban independence activism, fundraising, and organizing. I'm going to see Las Discípulas. It's just one image of many political clubs led by women. I wish I had more of those. These are the Mambisas of West Tampa. The Cubans were training every day in West Tampa, and then they would march down the streets and they would end up at Céspedes Hall. And these are the collections at the cigar factories of cigar makers giving money for the Cuban Revolutionary Party, for the independence movement. Tampa was probably the best funder of the Cuban Revolutionary Party. Too soon, the death of Martí devastated the cigar worker communities. Black banners and ribbons hung from buildings and homes for weeks. I think Armando Mendez quotes that. So here, I offer one of my memories. Me and Martí. We speak English now, except with Abuela Pepilla, who has refused to learn. We speak less and less, but I listen to the conversation around her garlic kitchen table at the Casita house on Calle Cherry. She wants me to learn to remember. She takes me to the Círculo Cubano for a solemn occasion. I recall white dresses, white roses, a white sun, a white marble head. It is Jose Martí. He's the father of our country. He led the fight against the Spaniards and gave speeches in Tampa. Later, I asked, Abuela, aren't your ancestors from Spain? She scowled. She wrinkled her nose. and leaned down with a pointed finger, and she said, "Nosotros somos cubanos." I think a lot of us get our identity from our grandmothers. So West Tampa develops rapidly and grows, becomes a large city with a much larger population, just growing in all of these years. So these are some images of old West Tampa. McFarland made a lot of money in West Tampa. He built the factories to lure the owners to come, but he sold all the real estate and all the housing and built, you know, I don't know if he had to pay, but he built the trolley and he built the Fortune Street Bridge and made a lot of money. I don't have a picture of him, and you're gonna understand why in a little while, because we're gonna talk about some different times. I hope I'm not lost. No, I'm good. Another important work that influenced me, The Spanish-Cuban-American War and the Birth of American Imperialism by Philip S. Foner, helped me to understand the love-hate relationship that Cubans have with the United States. And it's relevant today. So 1898, very interesting time in Tampa. 30,000 US soldiers suddenly arrive in this scrambled mess of arriving on trains that are backed up, and there's no food, and they got to put up all these tents, and they hate Tampa. They think it's a real backward place, and they don't like the Cubans who they encounter in Tampa. The Cubans who lobbied the U.S. Congress to intervene, and the Yellow National Press finally convinced McKinley to declare war against Spain. The Army chose Tampa as the port of embarkation, citing its climate and proximity to Cuba. 30,000 men arrived, camped in horrible environments at the outskirts of town, while officers and journalists enjoyed the luxurious Tampa Bay Hotel. The descriptions of wretched conditions in the camps of Tampa and of the Cubans by American leaders and soldiers abound in diaries of that time. And the local papers described many destructive incidents in saloons and in red district areas and in the community. The 6-week period in Tampa is a foreshadowing of tensions that will arise once the soldiers arrive in Cuba. And there's a wonderful MA thesis at USF Special Collections by Joan Steffi. She's documented that period of the time of the soldiers, a little before and after, the whole Cuban community from 1886 to 1898. And it's really worth finding and reading. Keeping in mind that the emigre communities kept in constant contact with Cuba through visits, family ties, and newspapers, for many Tampeños, the U.S. intervention and occupation of the island, the Constitution written in the U.S. with its Platt Amendment, dampened their hopes for Martí's vision of a sovereign nation committed to democratic, social, and racial justice. Subsequent U.S. military occupations further frustrated that vision. Los Mambises de West Tampa returned from the war with very negative views of occupied Cuba. After all, Tampeños also lived inside the monster. Okay. Here's the fun stuff. More and more factories and workers moved to West Tampa so that it surpassed Ybor City in the number of factories. By 1910, it was the 5th largest city in Florida. There is a West Tampa historic trail online, and there's Armando Mendez's book, Ciudad de Cigars, West Tampa, for a survey of all cigar manufacturers and factories. It's important to realize there's the buildings, but the names of the owners and the factories and the label constantly change. So it gets a bit confusing, so it's hard to track actually. So here we're going to have some images, many images of factories in West Tampa, workers, and a Buckeye. So here's McFarland. There are trade journals, tobacco and tobacco leaf. These are national trade journals. So McFarland's promoting West Tampa, and he is showing off all the factories in West Tampa. That's just fun stuff here. That's a lady dressed in tobacco leaves. It's an obsession. This is Ellinger Factory, but the community people called it Elinche, and it was the Elinche neighborhood, and later it becomes Robert City. I think that's the first brick factory. Yeah. So this is O'Halloran, who has replaced Del Pino in the very first factory on Main and Howard. These are the O'Halloran brothers. And I just love this picture. This is a Buckeye Three Friends Cigar Company. This is a beautiful factory that remains on Albany and Cherry.
Albany and Cherry. And the other one is Palmetto.
And Palmetto on the other end, yeah, the whole block. The color photos are mine from 2005-06. I tried to document the whole community. Cuesta Rey, very important factory. Willie Garcia's favorite factory. A beautiful factory, and if you see this building today, you will cry. Santa Ella, we're going to see it tomorrow. Celestino Vega. Berryman Morgan, the one that has been restored to like perfect historical specifications by a Lebanese gentleman named Nicholas Jamal. And he had offered for us to have our talk there, but it couldn't happen because of insurance things. Bustillo Brothers. I'm always confused by this one. I think it's on Albany. Yeah, it says Albany on the street sign. The first Samuel I. Davis, he moves later on to a really beautiful brick factory. Now, for example, I did a research on this factory for these people who wanted to buy it. And so it starts off as Samuel I. Davis, then it becomes Balbin Brothers, then it becomes Tampa, Cuba Cigar Company, then it is Diaz Havana Cigar Company, and then it's like DeSoto Brewery for a while in the 1930s. So these factories just keep changing tenants. Simonette, I'm really not sure where that is, but it shows up in Florida, in a West Tampa history. This one is another one that's name has probably changed, and we don't recognize that one right now. Andres Diaz is still there on Havana. And this is an important factory, the Morgan Cigar Company, one that has been renovated. Santa Ella, another very important factory, probably the largest. It had 1,000 workers in that factory, and it is still there today, and it's become a space for artists. Yeah, this is that Tampa, Cuba. You can see it's getting renovated and relabeled in 1915. I didn't know there was an Upman factory here. And this is the sad, they call this the heart, the hole in the heart of West Tampa. Because this was a very important world, the Cuesta Rey world. And unfortunately, that factory burned down in the 80s. And this is the empty lot where it's the site of Cuesta Rey. So, and some cigar workers. I always love this one because the woman, there's clearly women working here. That was my son, I've been chosen before, so, you know, a lot of workers. That's Cuesta Rey with the reader. And that's Cuesta Rey, because there's other things going on in these factories. There's a whole floor of women pulling the tobacco leaves apart. Despalillando. We call, and Americans call it strippers. And my grandmother did that for 30 years. I can't even imagine. There they are. Very young. People started working in these factories at a very young age. A lot of the people that told me stories was, I started working in the factory when I was 14, women, so they stopped going to school to go work in the factories. Okay, switching topic again. This is one of my favorites. One might consider the independence cause as a parenthesis within international labor activism in the Tampa cigar barrios. So they were active labor organizers before, and then they're interrupted by the Cuban independence movement, and they go right back in 1899 with the first major strike. I had a break in here somewhere. I just don't know where it is now. Yeah, it's here. So, the Labor Temple. I heard that you all had a tour of Ybor, but they didn't take you here. Well, it's probably the most important building for cigar workers. And I call it the place where they worshiped. Because OLPH is back there somewhere, the Old Lady of Perpetual Help, the Catholic Church. But this is where they worshiped.
It's a nightclub.
Cigar makers brought their radical traditions from the factories of Cuba to Key West and to West Tampa. Bolstered by several radical presses and lectores, Tampa's workers shifted their energies back to labor issues, organizing several major strikes beginning in 1899. Spanish and Sicilian cigar workers reinforced radical and anarchist ideas developed in their homelands. Early on, manufacturers blamed Spanish anarchists for disrupting the industry. A quote from a book, The Wonderful Life of Angelo Massari. When in 1902 I landed in Tampa, I found myself in a world of radicals for which I was prepared. And when I listened to speeches against the Catholic Church, I was not at all surprised. In those days in Tampa, anarchists and socialists were many. Also recall Gerald Pollo's chapter, The Anarchist Challenge to Cuban Independence. One Tampa anarchist leader, Carlos Balino, a friend of Martí, founded, I was told, the Communist Party, but I read Socialist Party, in Cuba in 1925. He was also the mayor of Martí City near Ocala. So he was very, a well-known leader in Tampa. There's a wonderful book by Sheldon Liss called Roots of Revolution, explaining the later revolution, and it includes Carlos Balino, Diego Tejera, and all these radicals in Key West and Tampa. Tampa elites in collusion with cigar manufacturers, very important to realize that the manufacturers were controlling things. They were the elite, they were the economic power of the town, they were the cultural leaders of the town. And so they pretty much ran things, or others ran things for them. They used several forms of intimidation and violence to end any disruption to the economic engine of Tampa, as they had promised, remember, when they were invited. With each walkout, so many, or general strike, the Board of Trade appointed vigilante citizens committees, led by the most prominent of Tampa's business and political leaders. McFarland, McKay Auditorium, Peter O'Knight Airport. Tactics included deportations, vigilante mobs, lynchings, lockouts, attacks on meetings at labor temples, closing of any labor halls, threats to individual organizers, constantly fueled by the editorial pages of the Tampa Morning Tribune and Mayor D.B. McKay, Tampa Times. So this is the 1899 wait strike. Or is it 1901 La Resistencia? Because I've heard two versions of that. But I notice in this photo, because I always pay attention, there's a lot of black faces. But they seem to disappear in later cigar worker photos. Huh?
The CMIU.
Oh, the segregated union. Oh, that explains some of that. Major strikes that paralyzed the city's economy occurred in 1899, the wait strike, 1901, led by the independent union that was affiliated with the Cuban Cigar Workers Union. When vigilante actions defeated the young, poorly funded union, La Resistencia. For a really terrific look and explanation of that union movement in Tampa among cigar workers, there are several articles by Durwood Long in Southern Labor History, and especially his article, La Resistencia, Tampa's Immigrant Labor Union. And here we have Here we have the very tragic image. The 1910 7-month strike featured a lynching of 2 Sicilians. There's an article by Joseph Scaglione called Tumult in the Cigar City, the Strike of 1910. Things got very violent. There was a shooting, there was a fire of a cigar factory. These guys were picked up. They weren't even cigar workers and they weren't even union organizers, so we don't really know why they were picked up. But the Italians often got blamed for being violent or anarchists or whatever. And so here they were. Okay. 1920 is another major strike. This is the La Huelga de 10 Meses. Old-timers used to mark their lives by this, mark the time in their life by the strike. You know, before La Huelga and after La Huelga. So this is led by the Cigar Makers International Union, which is a very American union. And as Susan points out, it was very different from the Cuban-style union, the independent one. But it was a fight for a closed or open shop. The union and the workers are pushing for a closed shop because they don't want strike breakers. Sometimes they don't want Spaniards. Sometimes they don't want Italians. They want a union member closed shop of workers in the factories. And it is a long battle. And I don't recall that there's violence during this time, but the cigar manufacturers also joined in an association, very powerful because they had the New York people involved and all that power. So they could just close the cigar factory and lock out the workers and let them go hungry for 10 months. And that's what happened here. Do we have the crabbing boats? Yeah, that was the, I'm showing this because they really are hungry. And so they're going to the Tampa Bay to get crabs. And, you know, we ate harina de jaiba, we ate croqueta de jaiba, we ate a lot of jaiba. And now they're famous devil crabs. Okay, 1931 is the last major strike, and it is, as Jose Iglesias describes it, the last strike that was not won by the cigar workers. They didn't have many victories except for maybe the wait strike.
1899.
That was it. Yeah. And I really want to mention this book because it describes the strikes, but it describes it from the point of view of the elites, the vigilantes, you know, what was going on in their world, their minds, that would cause them to organize violence. Of course, it was the Deep South. The South is known as a more violent place in the U.S. It is that post-Civil War era where, you know, honor and any excuse to lynch somebody or it's a violent place. So he puts this whole experience within that Deep South cultural context. And I think it's important. Because I think it's a unique experience for Cubans to land in the Deep South. And with its racial order, so different. I'm going to hold questions, if you don't mind, because I get lost. Okay. West Tampa flourished during the cigar boom that peaked in the 1920s, but declined dramatically with the Depression of the 1930s. Again, the attraction to socialist ideas emerged in the nation and in Tampa. Tampeños remember May 1st marches featuring songs like Banderas Rojas. 3,000 workers signed on to a communist organized union in 1 week. That's all documented in Robert Engel's book. Also, Jose Iglesias, the novelist, writes about this world, this time, in a novel called The Truth About Them, and an article, The Radical Island in the Deep South. That's where I stole that line. We're getting to a break. The workers mobilized once again to support the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. Many forms of fundraising allowed them to send a variety of supplies, including 2 ambulances. Tampa was the second most contributing city to the Republican cause after New York. Tampeños and Cubanos joined the international brigades. Many Spanish families received news of the war in Tampa and news of deaths. It was a wonderful project led by Ana Varela, and I hope you can find her work on No Pasarán, the Spanish Civil War movement in Tampa. Yes, so here's an image from that time period, the Spanish Civil War era, and these are the women marching. There's a lot of women there. That's 7th Avenue, Ybor City. And the next one is a crowd at the Centro Asturiano of a committee that is raising funds for the Spanish War sufferers. People were so organized, you know, they could get things done. And I think it's because of those clubs where they could come together.
No phones.
Huh?
No phones.
Yeah. Tampa celebrated the 60th anniversary of the International Brigades in a series of events fall 1997, organized by USF Latin American Studies with the members of the Centro Asturiano, the USF Contemporary Art Museum, and the Dali Museum. And I mention that because, you know, 60 years later after the march, and these people, we're still celebrating what Tampa did during the Spanish Civil War. We had Abraham Lincoln Brigade veterans, 1997. Okay. I think we'll take a break here, if you want. This,
All right.
you know, I'm trying to go Russian era in Tampa. The new deal WPA sent unemployed cigar makers to clear the field for a base at the south end of the Peninsula MacDill Field. Now, I always wonder, why are they building an Air Force base before Pearl Harbor? Because this is 1930s. Oh, well. Pepe Belen, the Lion of Arch Street, complained, "They send us to kill snakes so that we are too tired to think about revolution." They were truly matando culebras. At this point, outsiders coming in to try to figure out what's going on with the cigar industry. It's dying out, there's unemployment. It was such a successful industry for the whole state of Florida. I mean, it was the industry. So it caused The decline caused distress among the elites and the workers. Many families moved to New York or looked for work in other cities. The federal government sent the WPA writers and ethnographers to conduct a study of the Latin community. The life histories, you gotta see these, the life histories of cigar workers offer diverse views on politics and social issues. A University of Florida economist filed a report on the industry, noting the special character of the Latin workers. They prefer to share the work rather than see a fellow worker laid off. That seemed very unusual. That's Stuart A. Campbell, The Cigar Industry of Tampa, Florida. Gainesville University of Florida. Bureau of Economic and Business Research, 1939. Another dramatic case in our lovely history is the case of Joseph Shoemaker. The Depression marked a failure of capitalism to sustain the U.S. society. Unemployment fostered socialist and communist activity in the nation. During the Red Scare in Tampa, vigilantes targeted Joseph Shoemaker. He was from Ohio, and an activist on unemployment issues. He was not a socialist, and he was not really a union organizer. So they arrested Shoemaker and 2 others. They were threatened a week before, then taken to a police station where a deputy, so-called deputy, intervened and took them away in a car to Brandon. Accused of being communists, they were beaten and tarred and feathered. Police and Ku Klux Klan were implicated in the crime. Joseph Shoemaker died 9 days later in hospital. The incident was reported nationally, causing several national organizations to lobby the government for action. Perpetrators were indicted, they were tried, and they were tried again on appeal, but there was no conviction. The negative publicity and the declining cigar industry led to a complete turnaround among the Tampa elite, ending the vigilante violent culture of Tampa. The same political and business leaders who had organized the repression denounced the violent culture. Tampa's national reputation as a politically corrupt and violent city was really bad for business. And so here, oops, where are we? The Tar Today image. Just keep going, let's see if we can, oh, this is culture and society. I'm confused. Anyway. It's not there.
Unless it's at the
Tar Today. Anyway, there's this wonderful photo of a Tampa businessman, Southern Lumber Company, put up a billboard that said, "Tar today, whitewash tomorrow," as a kind of a protest of what had been happening in Tampa. So they really did change their attitudes. World War II, I call it the Americanizando period, and some of us call it the Encracando period. World War II marks the end of the golden era in the cigar city. GIs did not return to work in cigar factories. They moved into more mainstream occupations or started small businesses, especially in the building trade. The factories hired women to work the new machines. They left the casitas to build their casas de bloque further west of Old West Tampa. GIs who attended University of Tampa went on to be teachers and principals. Some went on to law schools, and a few women attended Florida State University for Women. A group known as the Tampa Bananas attended the University of Florida. And this is my memory of that transition to Americana. Exiles on Main Street. My father built a Cape Cod house on Calle Main and Maxwell Place at the southeast corner of the McFarland Park Cross. We left poverty and abuelos behind in the barrio of Llega y Pon. I had to translate, she insisted, my manager, to join America. The house invited me, family and friends for Noche Buena Feast. The park invited many, new neighbors with strange names. Davis, Bridges, Whaling, Wallace, and McCaffrey. Okay, now we're at culture and society. That's a West Tampa scene, the Rooster Fright. A self-contained enclave, West Tampa residents enjoyed a rich social and cultural urban life. The Centro Español de West Tampa and the Sicilian Club provided centers for community cultural activities. Both remain architectural examples worthy of preservation. This is the Centro Español de West Tampa. It's really a branch of the Ybor City Centro. And there was a theater at the other one, but yeah, the Royal Theater at the Centro. Latinos enjoyed friendly porch socials in the neighborhoods, live theater, weekend, and matinee dances at all the clubs, Ray Park, picnics at Dallas Point, fiestas, talent shows, movies, restaurants, trips to the beach, cafes, bodegas, shops along Howard Avenue, and men-only domino or card games at the Centro's Cantina. This society collapsed in the late 1960s, and we can sort of discuss why. West Tampa is fortunate to have the full kaleidoscope of historic homes. Front porches are essential to the community as a means of socializing and protecting one's neighborhood and children. So here are some images of the housing, the houses. That's really early on. They call it tenement houses, and I keep arguing that we never called them tenement houses. This is an updated casita, cigar maker home, shotgun, whatever you want to call them. This is one of the really early ones. It's still on Union Street, but it doesn't look like that. This Main Street has some really beautiful examples of all of the different generations and styles. I think houses say a lot about people and about what's going on in the community and in the family. This is Nassau Street. This is not an old picture. This is contemporary.
Street I grew up on.
The one on the right is a house from Los Cien, and they all look like this, although this is a really nice example with the swans. But there's a bunch of houses in this particular neighborhood where the cigar kind of the higher level cigar makers pool their money in a cooperative to buy these houses. And they're still there. No. These two are right across the street from El Reloj factory. And it's a reminder of their Key West connection because the gingerbread, that's a Key West feature. And around this time, the Interstate 275 was expanding, and they took Laurel Street. So I went over there and documented all the houses being demolished and torn down. This was the Regano family home. You see the windows are all gone. And those are the casas de bloque that we all aspire to. And unfortunately, many of them disappeared. This is a really good image of the Sicilian Club on the left with the Kazan Theater. There was the Kazan Theater for movies. It was also called the West Town at one time.
West Town later, yeah.
Did Royal Theater show movies? Yes.
What?
Royal Theater show movies also, right?
Royal Theater was where the Centro Español is located. That was
Yeah.
the Royal Theater forever.
Showed movies.
This one is the one that changed names from
Yeah.
Kazan to West Town.
Yeah, and there was an African American theater at the end of Main Street, the Carver.
Lincoln.
The Lincoln, there, yes, I remember that one too. The bank, very important institution in West Tampa. It also became the 4th of July Cafe,
Later.
one of many iterations of the 4th of July Cafe, but this is the last location of 4th of July, and now closed. Yeah. This is from Cynthia Garcia Tamargo. Her family's, I'm not sure what was going on in this place, but it looks to me like a major store, and it looks like a boarding house
Yes.
also.
There were two big cigar factories that sandwiched that building. You
Really?
had the Celestino Vega on the north, and you had Garcia and Vega on the south.
Okay.
So a lot of rooming house facilities were upstairs,
Oh, okay.
and they take their meals downstairs.
I love this picture. Okay, Elise. Yeah. Aleman Hardware, this is like one of the businesses that existed. I think it was on Howard Avenue.
Howard and Chestnut was Aleman's Hardware.
But it looks like like there's this empty lot or something.
That does not remind me of his hardware store, because I used to frequent it as a little kid.
That was before you were born.
Yeah, obviously. Aleman was a prominent businessman in West Tampa, and he was from the Canary Islands, and they referred to him as El Isleño, even though his name meant German, Aleman. But he was from the Canary Islands, very nearsighted, wore very thick lenses, Coca-Cola bottom lenses.
Ferreteria.
Oh, that's still there. The building
That,
is still
yes,
there.
this is a typical bodega. We have a lot of bodegas in West Tampa still. And we lost a lot, but probably the only place where you will see corner bodegas. This was Mistrede at the time, but now it's Main Street Grocery.
Mhm. Nova Vista. That's on
Nova
Howard.
Vista,
Right next to the Sicilian Club.
at this time, it was a cooperative grocery store. And the building, this is an old photo, but it's been much improved.
And it's for sale?
Since this photo was
The
taken.
new life.
We're gonna tour West Tampa tomorrow, you're gonna see a place that's in decline and maybe coming back, but what I call it preservation by neglect. Okay? The houses are still there, the buildings are still there. We had a sign for many years, it said, "It's time for West Tampa." Big mural on the main corner. And I think it was there for 30 years. It's time for West Tampa, and we're still waiting. So, you know, it's sort of a double-edged sword. It's like, it's preserved because it's so neglected and undiscovered. But it's coming. It's coming. This is my favorite bodega. This is, you see the changing of the population. Bodegas tell you the whole story. The ethno-history is like, okay, first they're Cuban. Well, no, first they're Italian. Then they're Cuban. Then they're Mexican. Then they're Colombian or Puerto Rican. And you can see that in West Tampa. It's becoming really much more diverse. We have Colombian restaurant, we have Mexican, we have Peruvian. It's a great place.
Oh, yeah.
If anybody wants to go there any day of the week.
Yes.
He's still there, they painted him recently, white and black spots.
But you can't get a Cuban sandwich for $1.
Yeah. But that wasn't so long ago, that was 2005. You can get a really great dinner for $3.99 at the Borinquen Meat Market in the back. It's really good.
Very famous.
This is 1950s. I remember going there for comic books. My grandmother lived around the corner. McFarland Park, the great entrance to the park, and we're so grateful to have that park in West Tampa. This is an early view. Baseball is the pastime in West Tampa, still.
That's gone.
This is the new mural at McFarland Park, which two painters from that factory where the artists live. And I was the consultant, so I'm the one that stuck that woman in there.
Thank you.
Because, you know, you get tired of, I get tired of images of dead white men. You know, so now and then, okay, she's not alive, but she is representing. So we have Robert Saunders, the great leader of the civil rights movement in Tampa, who grew up in Robert City and has written about growing up in Robert City. Luisa Capetillo, Puerto Rican, activist, radical, lectora, union organizer. Jose Marti.
Who's that?
Took the words right out of my mouth. Great minds. And that's McFarland. And that's Fernando Figueredo. Now, this is a kaleidoscope, so you see there's layers. So we put in cigar making chair, tobacco leaves, buildings, and my Calusa Native American spears. You have to remember who was here first.
No, la chaveta.
Oh yeah, there is chaveta. Where is it?
Up on top.
Oh yeah, that's la chaveta.
El machete también.
Oh yeah. Those are the mavisas.
Okay.
Kaleidoscope, it's called. Oh no, we're just gonna flash through these. Baseball. We're so proud of this little league team that won the world championship. That's your photo.
I played for 4
This
years.
is another baseball family, famous baseball family. Hipólito Arenas. I've heard from his descendants bragging about being a baseball family. It's so cool. And that's the original McFarland Park gazebo. The trolley from West Tampa, Ybor City. Very important link. This is the last trolley ride. Mary Jagunde sent me that. 1946. And that's E.J. Salsina's dad's department store on the corner. And Eagle Drugs, another great family, the Chiminos. First schools, Academy of Holy Names, early, 1896. The Methodist School, 1898. And St. Joseph, 1903. I think they're all on Albany Avenue, these, and there's historic markers. for
All
these
on Albany.
schools. Cuesta had to build his own school for the Cuesta Ray workers' kids. So, and now demolished. The Methodist Church, very active. You know, it's like the missionaries had to come help all those poor Cubans. And the Rosa Valdez settlement is part of the Methodist missionaries world. And really it's still there, very supportive of the community. I think because some of them were anti-Catholic, I don't really understand, but the Italians had the Italian Baptist mission, and the Methodists were there, present, and supported. So that's a whole topic somebody needs to research. And we have historic African-American churches in West Tampa. A lot of them. And they go back to early 1900s, 1920s. This is our Black Jesus on Rome Avenue at the Mount Pleasant Church. And this is the
My
new
church.
St. Joseph Church. That's always been supported by the community. Very beautiful. Now it's mostly Mexicans attending. We have the Virgen de Guadalupe celebration, and I'm really glad that it's continuing and maintaining that tradition in West Tampa. I call this the Flying Buttress Church, just because I like it, and it's on Rome Avenue. It's an abandoned building. I don't know much about it. Of course, a lot of people were dying. They were dying like flies in this cigar world, so that the medical needs arose, and they organized hospitals and clinics, and a lot of them were dying. So we had our own Colon Cemetery. Havana has the famous Colon Cemetery. So of course West Tampa had to name their cemetery El Colon. Later on they changed it to Martí Cemetery, but now it's called Colon Martí. And this is some of the really beautiful. This was it's a really fun place, because I remember this Sherife Association annual parade. And so they had, because we were the Wild West, we had the cowboys and we had the Indians. And on horseback, a lot of these people.
It's funny how it's not the Sheriff Association, it's the Cherife.
Sherife.
Sherife
Yes, of
Association.
course. This is Main Street today. It's much more African-American. So that Old West Tampa is now African-American neighborhood, and the others moved west of Old West Tampa to the Casas de Bloque. So the old wooden frame houses are occupied, and that's why they've been preserved. Okay, are we done? Okay. I'm very interested in this whole racial ethnic divide, and I think Tampa gives us a great example to study. Not the black and white divide necessarily, but the brown, black, white class divides. It becomes very interesting. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I like all the taboo subjects. Gerald Pollo found that during the independence era, Cuban communities in the United States, and particularly Florida, were in the vanguard of accepting and promoting a multiracial version of Cubanidad. When the order from Estrada Palma called for termination of political clubs, the December 10th club dissolved and separated along racial lines, Ciclo Cubano and La Unión Martí Maceo. The debate about the club segregation centers on this question. Did the laws of the state of Florida in the form of Jim Crow force Cubans to self-segregate?
It wasn't against the law at that time. The Jim Crow laws came into effect successively, and mutual aid societies, social clubs were not required to be segregated. That was a myth.
Self-imposed. Okay, so all right. So did the laws of the state of Florida force the Cubans to self-segregate, or did they follow the Cuban custom of segregating social spaces, or any places where men and women may meet, talk, dance, or fall in love? And I found that in Cuba today, till now.
It was the same in Cuba.
Yeah.
The social clubs were segregated in Cuba before the Americans got there. And
Oh, yeah. The transcultural journey of becoming Americano requires complex adjustments to identity, values, and culture. We know that Cubanos de Tampa resisted, confronted, and questioned the Southern racial order. But they also negotiated space, language, identity, and values. In the case of Cubans, the experiences formed layered identities that include exile, immigrant, blanco o negro, Cubano, Latin, Spanish, Tampeño, Hispanic, or Latino, and all of the above all at the same time. One adjustment required new definitions of racial identity as Cubans migrated from trigueño, mestizo, mulatto, Cuba to the one-drop rule of Jim Crow. Apartheid tore up families, friends, and neighbors, as well as social and political organizations. And it happened very early on. There are some cases that I call civil rights Cuban style. In 1915, the Cuban consul, Martinez Ibor's son, Rafael, filed a discrimination complaint with the State Department against Fred Lease, manager of a resort, Goldstein Spring, regarding a sign that read, "No Cubans allowed." Martinez Ibor confronted the manager and said, "Do you mean all Cubans are not allowed?" "Oh no, Mr. Ibor. We don't mean you. We're referring to those other Cubans. Similar signs greeted them at Clearwater Beach and other locations. The editor of the St. Pete Times, Mr. Straub, suggested that Cubans should leave Pass-a-Grille Beach and find a separate beach for them. Martinez Ybor debated the discrimination in the editorial pages of the St. Pete Times and Tampa Tribune, sort of like a Twitter war today, but it was in the editorial pages. The next generation of Cubans assimilated to Americano culture gradually, facing racist discrimination along the way. The Latinos of Tampa were geographically and socially positioned in the middle. Many of the elders I interviewed recalled signs that read "No dogs and no Cubans," although some recall signs that said "No dogs and no Latins." Perhaps the community in solidarity with the Cubans claimed the discrimination. Latinas could not try out for cheerleader at Hillsborough High School and would not be employed by Moss Brothers. Jose Iglesias wrote, "The favorite racial slur by Anglos toward all Latinos, can you guess? Cuban nigger." And now we got the racial map. So again, this is my time period, my growing up experience. I'm sure it's not everyone's. Note that the Latin and, okay, I have to point out, let me point this out. Okay, West Tampa and Ybor City, the negotiated middle geographically, okay? In my time era, even up through the 1960s, we did not go north. That was Craca land, scary. There were actually race wars between Anglo, what you would call, I don't know, rural people, country people maybe, to the north, and elite whites to the south. We had a better time going south of the border, Kennedy Boulevard, south of the border. Okay? For some reason, geographically, we could move here, but it was scary to go north. It was also really scary to go east, like Plant City, to rural areas. The African American neighborhood is kind of in between Ybor City and West Tampa. And then there's an African American neighborhood in West Tampa, close to the river. There's actually a mixed neighborhood in Robert City. I think these neighborhoods were kind of mixed racially, but there were dividing lines, unofficial dividing lines. And our colleagues, Cheryl Rodriguez, an anthropologist who grew up in this world, said, and she's a daughter of Francisco Rodriguez, she said, "My world ended at Howard Avenue."
Yep, I was gonna say that.
See or
I was
no?
gonna say that. I grew up on the other side of Howard Avenue, and that was the line.
That was the line.
Howard Avenue divided.
And I don't believe they shopped in all the stores on Howard Avenue.
Right.
I don't think so. So in West Tampa, there is this racial divide, and then within the larger community, you know, there's this sort of unofficial racial divide. It's a very interesting place for anybody who wants to look deeper into this topic. And then another case that I'm really interested in is the school segregation case. While reading Armando Mendez's book, Ciudad de Cigars, I found a gem. To meet the rapidly growing needs of the immigrant communities, the county decided to incorporate existing schools. They encountered the integrated Cespedes School of West Tampa. Claiming it violated state law of separate but equal, the school board ordered the school to segregate. The West Tampa community resisted for 4 years, citing they could not turn their backs on the contributions of Black Cubans in the War for Independence. However, Fernando Figueredo Socatras, that great leader, was called upon to negotiate. Eventually, the Black Cuban children were forced to attend colored school number 2. That's how early this is. It's really early on in our history. The city of West Tampa claimed the building the Cespedes Hall building, when it experienced financial troubles and converted it to a city hall. They demolished Cespedes Hall to build a new city hall around 1900, according to Arsenio Sanchez. Ironically, West Tampa had an integrated school that was forced to segregate, then became the first neighborhood school to integrate at McFarland Park Elementary, 1962. Bobby Saunders. I think we have an image of him. Yes, we should. Yeah, there he is. The son of the great civil rights leader of Florida, Robert Saunders. The informal segregation of schools reflects the negotiated spaces. Students of West Tampa and Ybor City attended Jefferson High School. A look at a Jefferson Dragon yearbook of the 50s or 60s tells the story. 90+% of students have like Spanish last names at Jefferson High School. The school asserted its Latin identity each year, marching to Spanish and Cuban music in the Gasparilla Parade. Sometimes that sort of keeping together, staying together, reinforces your cultural identity, and it definitely did in my time period at the high school. And the Latino Jefferson High School was the first school to be integrated at the high school level, received the first Black American students when the county was forced to integrate the school system around 1964, 65. I was there at the time, and it went without incident, so that the Anglo communities could sort of put off integrating their schools, because we could check off that box that said, oh, we've integrated the schools. We sent them to the Latinos. This is my memory related to this whole race confusion issue for me. I call it raza cosmica. Lost in America, I look for myself in the school books. Jane, Dick, and Sally have perfect parents and blonde hair. Lost in America, I look for myself on TV. No, I'm not there. I look for me in the newspapers. I do not exist. I look for me in aged family photos. A wrinkled dark woman wearing a mantilla. Is she African or Indian or Spanish or all of these? Is that me? And my great-grandfather, he looks like Chairman Mao. Is that me? Am I Chinese? My DNA says Portuguese. I lost the political culture. I wanted to just mention generation that came of age during the Depression worshipped Franklin Roosevelt. Many West Tampa natives remain active supporters of the Democratic Party as the party for workers. The Democratic Club of West Tampa met at Faedo's Bakery for decades, and they actually appeared in Time magazine, written by Cristina Garcia, the novelist. She was a journalist, apparently. And here's President Kennedy, and Robert Saunders is in this photo. And this is in Tampa.
1963.
Charles Parrish and others document the progressive leanings of the Latin community. In the 1948 election, the Ybor and West Tampa precincts voted for socialist Henry Wallace, vice president to Franklin Roosevelt, in larger percentages than any other precinct in the nation. Wallace spoke at Phillips Field to an audience of mostly Black and Latino supporters. And Braulio Alonso has wrote about this in La Gaceta sometime in the 1990s, remembering that Henry Wallace campaign. Okay, where are we going? Cuba sí, Yankee no. The connection to Cuba remained strong for generations. Cuban news arrived daily on Pan Am flights during the 1950s. Cubans traveled back and forth frequently until 1961. West Tampa families welcomed exiles from Batista's government and exiles from Castro's government. Most Tampeños supported the Cuban Revolution in 1958-59. Women smuggled arms under crinoline skirts. Remember 1950s? And Jose Iglesias tells the story of clandestine activities in his novel, Awake in Ybor. A 26th of July political group held court at the El Pasaje Hotel building. The group invited Fidel Castro to speak, November 1955. On January 1st, 1959, a parade of cars blowing horns left El Ciclo Cubano to ride around and around Ybor City and West Tampa. Is that a Cuban thing, the blowing horns thing? I heard that in Cuba too. The Cuban Council of Tampa had to change guard. And the local mafia, our local mafia leader, Santo Traficante, went missing for days. And here's a memory from this time period in my life. Abuela talks to the radio. I arrived from school to find Abuela Pepilla in deep conversation with Fidel on the radio. At school, I have learned the terrible news. Abuela, you are a communist. She unplugs the radio. She takes it to her room. She turns it on back, high volume, and continues her conversation with Fidel and the revolution. This is very typical of these people at that time, 1960. As Batistianos arrived in West Tampa, tensions flared. The historic Cubans faced FBI interrogations and red paint splattered on their homes. A struggle for control of the Ciclo Cubano ensued, but the old cigar workers prevailed, and it was thanks to a woman who was the leader of the Ciclo Cubano at that time. Exiles built the Club Cívico Cubano on the outskirts of town. The embargo of tobacco killed the cigar industry finally. Travel ended. Exiles succeeded in silencing all talk about Cuba for decades. sort of an underlying sort of threat always present. Okay, now we're going to the fun stuff. I call it Cubanidad on steroids. Also in West Tampa, because this is where all the Cubans land, right? And keep sort of regenerating, reinvigorating Cuba to the core culture. So let's just show some of those. All of them? Where's Papito? Oh, Sugar Man. This is all Columbus Drive, by the way, mostly. This is Cafe Society.
Is it Jimmy Galen?
We have kept up the tradition of people meeting and talking, and like they did in the social clubs, but now we do it in the cafes. Cafe Society, I call it. Let's see, Jay and me. In the last 10, 15 years, a lot of these people are no longer with us. That's Deputy Dog. Angel Rañón. Okay, West Tampa received a strong infusion of Cuban culture when urban renewal leveled Ybor City and Robert City. In addition, political exiles in the 60s and 70s, Mariel refugees in the 80s, and Balseros in the 90s added a strong dose of Cubanidad to the historic community. Y siguen llegando. A visit to West Tampa cafes reminds one of the social clubs without the sound of clanging dominoes. Surround sound Spanish greets your ears. The menus are always Spanish-Cuban. It's no wonder that the iconic symbols of Tampa are Cuban cigars, Cuban bread, Cuban sandwiches, and Cuban coffee, enjoyed in the cafe societies of West Tampa. Okay, so here is my last poetic memory. I call it the curse. I left West Tampa, but always remain Cubana. It is a Tampeño curse to perceive the world through those workers of the world, abuelo tabaquero eyes. A curse to always side with los de abajo. Martin Luther King and Raza Unida. Independistas, anti-imperialistas, feministas, and Jesse Jackson. Okay, final image. This is West Tampa recently. Somos Cubanos. So it's not just me. And I think there's one last image for the, yeah. This is my street, my neighborhood, my house, and these are a Mexican family from across the street. And truly, West Tampa is the place for immigrants today and always. And it should be a sanctuary city.